Under the dense jungle canopy of the Owen Stanley Range in Papua New Guinea, one of the most exhausting and key campaigns of the Second World War unfolded throughout the second half of 1942. The Kokoda Track Campaign took its name from the track that ran for roughly 96 kilometres, from Oa's Corner near Port Moresby to the village of Kokoda near the northern coast. It cut through some of the most rugged terrain in the Pacific and rose to more than 2,000 metres above sea level in places. This combination of elevation and environment turned the distance into a constant test of endurance. Australian soldiers were thrown into a severe environment with mountainous terrain, tropical disease, and constant Japanese pressure. Rather than meeting the enemy in open fields or fortified positions, they advanced and retreated along a narrow foot track that twisted through ridges, gullies, and rain-soaked jungle, which forced them to adapt quickly or face destruction. In this hostile terrain, the Kokoda Track became both a physical battlefield and a mental test that helped prevent Japanese forces from reaching the capital of Port Moresby and threatening Australia's northern frontier. Following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese had a rapid expansion of control across the Pacific, including the capture of the strategically important British base in Singapore in February 1942. Imperial planners then primarily shifted focus towards isolating Australia from the United States. By January 1942, Japanese command identified Port Moresby as a key objective that, if captured, would potentially allow aerial bombardment of northern Australia and sever key Allied supply lines. Initially, the Japanese had sent their navy to seize control by sea. However, they were stopped by a combined American and Australian fleet at the Battle of the Coral Sea on the 4th to the 8th of May 1942. Unable to reach the city by sea, the Japanese sought to march troops across land to capture Port Moresby instead. Their revised strategy relied on landing troops at the northern beachheads of Boona and Gona and advanced southward over the Owen Stanley Range by way of the Kokoda Track. Major General Tomitaro Hori commanded the South Seas Detachment, which drove this overland assault. Although Australian intelligence analysts initially believed the track could not support a major offensive, the Allied commanders in the region had to rely upon the only available defenders in Papua New Guinea at the time, the 39th Militia Battalion troops from Australia. Militia were not regular army soldiers. They were volunteers composed mostly of young men with little battlefield experience. Regardless, they were instructed to advance north along the jungle path known as the Kokoda Track to engage the Japanese and attempt to slow them down. Around 140 of these Australian troops reached the village of Kokoda on the 15th of July 1942. Brigadier Arnold Potts led the Maroubra Force, which included the 39th Battalion as well as some members of the Papuan Infantry Battalion during the early fighting, and attempted to delay any Japanese advance. On the 21st of July, around 1,500 soldiers of the Japanese South Seas Force landed near Gona and Boona on the north coast of Papua New Guinea and pushed inland quickly. As Japanese forces crossed the Kamusi River and moved toward the Kokoda Plateau, Australian units attempted to delay them through small ambushes and brief fights. The first contact with the Japanese forces occurred at Awala on the 23rd of July. They were fighting under dense foliage and heavy rain as they awaited reinforcements from the Australian Imperial Force. The militia troops were significantly outnumbered and knew that they did not stand much hope in a direct battle with the Japanese forces. So it was decided that they were to gradually retreat back down the track they had marched up while fighting a series of smaller battles. As the Australians retreated, the Japanese advance did slow down as hoped. After they had lost ground at Awala, Australian troops fell back to the plateau village of Kokoda, where they tried to hold the position against increasingly aggressive Japanese attacks. After heavy fighting, the defenders withdrew again on the 29th of July, establishing new defensive lines further south at Izarava by the 14th of August. Between the 26th and 31st of August, some of the most brutal fighting of the campaign occurred. The 39th Battalion had received reinforcements and were now supported by the 53rd Australian Battalion, 2nd 14th Battalion, and elements of the 2nd 16th Battalion. They numbered around 2,000 soldiers and resisted a large Japanese attack from almost 4,000 invaders. Although outnumbered and physically weakened, Australian soldiers still launched repeated counterattacks and caused many casualties among the attackers. In one of the most well-known moments of the campaign, Private Bruce Kingsbury charged a Japanese position with a Bren gun and temporarily halted their advance on the 29th of August, an act of bravery for which he received a posthumous Victoria Cross. However, despite putting up fierce resistance, the Australians were quickly outgunned. They lost 200 men, and realising that they were facing complete annihilation if they stayed, the Australians had to fall back once more. As they moved through constant rain and thick mud, Australian forces often lacked supplies or rest, while enduring bullets and artillery and also disease, leeches and hunger. Japanese troops, though better supplied at the outset, soon began to suffer similar hardships as their supply lines stretched across mountain ridges and became easier for Australians to disrupt. As both armies weakened, the role of Papuan civilians became increasingly vital. These men were known respectfully as the fuzzy Wuzzy Angels and carried the wounded, hauled ammunition, and navigated dangerous trails with quiet determination, often without any protection or medical aid themselves. Allied airmen tried to support the soldiers as best they could by dropping supplies along the track, while also making repeated air attacks on the enemy's supply lines. By this stage, however, the Australians had retreated so far that they were almost back at Port Moresby again. The Allies reached the village of Iorubaiwa around the 14th of September, just 50 kilometres from Port Moresby, and they finally stopped at Imita Ridge, only 40 kilometres from the city, on the 17th of September 1942. It was at this time that General Thomas Blamey was appointed as the Australian Commander-in-Chief. He arrived in Port Moresby with a commission to try and turn the situation around. Also, by mid-September, the experienced Australian 7th Division had arrived, which included veterans of the North African campaign. It was hoped that together they would change the course of the Kokoda campaign. By the 24th of September, the Japanese had advanced far beyond the range of their supply lines. As a result, they had been dangerously low on both food and ammunition for almost 2 weeks. Japanese commanders concluded they could not hold their position, as the soldiers were exhausted and starving. So Horai ordered his troops to retreat back north along the Kokoda Track to reconnect with fresh supplies. However, it was not until Allied patrols explored the area on the 28th of September that they discovered that the Japanese had gone. The Australians decided to pursue them, and the roles of the two armies were now reversed. Australian commanders now had fresh troops and were more familiar with the terrain and advanced northward. Units that had previously endured the retreat through Isurava and Afoji on the 5th to 6th of September then moved forward, pursuing a weakened enemy along the same trail that had once threatened their survival. Allied air support significantly disrupted Japanese supplies and helped the Australian pursuit continue. In early November, Australian troops recaptured Kokoda village and raised the Australian flag, reversing months of territorial loss. Australian patrols entered the Kokoda station on the 2nd of November 1942 and secured the airstrip on the 3rd. However, Japanese resistance continued at defensive beachheads along the north coast. Fighting at Oivi and Gorari between the 4th and 11th of November, and then at Buna, Gona and Sanananda from mid-November 1942 until the 22nd of January 1943, required hard infantry attacks against bunkers, snipers and hidden machine gun nests. The final battles of the campaign inflicted heavy casualties on both sides, and Japanese troops frequently refused to surrender and often fought to the death. By the conclusion of the campaign, Australia had suffered more than 600 killed and roughly 1,600 wounded in the fighting on the Kokoda Track and related operations. This included nearly 100 men lost at Isurava alone. Japanese fatalities in the Papua fighting ran into the thousands, with estimates placing Imperial Japanese Army killed in action at around 8,000, and with total Japanese losses, when illness and wounds were included, approaching 15,000. The fighting over the Kokoda Track largely helped prevent Japan from capturing Port Moresby. Australia showed that inexperienced troops under extreme conditions could hold their own against a determined enemy. I hope that you have enjoyed learning about the Kokoda campaign of World War II. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out the free resources on the History Skills website. I look forward to seeing you again soon on our next video.